sitting as a member of Congress asking Ben Bernanke whether he supported silver as an alternative circulating money and whether we needed alternative money. And the central bankers have said, no, we don't need money. Hey everybody, this is Rob Keens of Gold Silver Pros doing a special report for JM Bullion. This week is Thanksgiving Day week, and what I often like to do during these periods is take a moment and go down the path of history and economics and finance and revisit an old period. It's a good time to do it during the holidays when you have plenty of time, a lot of time sitting around watching football and spending time with families. But a lot of times I always found myself itching to learn something new, to study something, to do something productive during the off season. What I would do is go look at monetary history. So that's what we're going to do here today for the video. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing. And we're going to talk about a period of time known as the Great Inflation. And that period of time was marked by what we had issues with unemployment, issues with inflation and prices and all of these things. It was the period I'm talking about between 1965 and 1982, known as the Great Inflation. Here is a website that has a lot of history promoted by a lot of people that write about the Federal Reserve. This particular story called The Great Inflation was written by Michael Bryan from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. So he's one of the Fed's bankers. And the description of the story, as you can see here, is the Great Inflation was the defining macroeconomic period of the second half of the 20th century, lasting from 1965 to 1982. It led economists to rethink the policy of the Fed and other central banks. The reason I'm bringing this up on today's video is to talk about not only this area of great inflation, but how I think we may be going into another era of great inflation and how that may affect us as well, and what are the similarities and differences back then, and maybe even an examination of how we got to where we are now. There's a lot to cover in this story. I'm going to go over certain parts of it, but essentially, the Great Inflation was measured a time period in which prices just were persistently higher than they ever had been in history, and as measured afterwards, up until what we're seeing now. So right now we're seeing at 7.7% inflation. We've had prints this year as high as over 9%. So you definitely could see we're in a similar period. And that has been persistent basically all year. Now, it's not a 17-year period of history, but when we go through why the Great Inflation occurred, I think that you'll agree with me that a lot of things that we saw back then are what we're dealing with right now. So to get a little bit of history about that, it says here in the article, in 1964, inflation measured a little more than 1% per year. It had been in this vicinity over the preceding 6 years. Inflation began ratcheting upward in the mid-1960s and reached more than 14% in 1980. It eventually declined to average only 3.5% in the latter half of the 1980s. And of course, the modern day Fed target on inflation is only 2%, though the Fed has come out and say that they may think that what we should target as inflation as a central bank should be really in the 3.5% to 4%. So a little bit of moving goalposts there, perhaps affected by the current period of inflation. Back to the article. While economists debate the relative importance of the factors that motivated and perpetuated inflation for more than a decade, there is little debate about its source. The origins of the Great Inflation were policies that allowed for an excessive growth of the supply of money, Federal Reserve policies. And again, this is written by Michael Bryan, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And he's going to go in there to also say how Congress had passed policies that allowed the central bank to have these policies and these standards, which caused us to get into this great inflation. So it really was between the government, the needs of the people, and the central bank. There's a lot of blame to go around. Michael goes on to write, to understand this episode of especially bad policy, and monetary policy in particular, it will be useful to tell the story in three distinct but related parts. And he goes to say it's going to be a forensic investigation. I'm going to summarize this. First of all, the Phillips curve was something that existed that said, if you want full employment and you're willing to deal with perhaps some inflation on some sort of curve, you can use that curve to manage it. And back then, because before 1965, and we didn't have persistently high inflation, inflation was considered more of an inconvenience, not something that was ever going to rear its ugly head. But unemployment, remember the Great Depression and the war and the aftermath of that and the rebuilding of the American economy, how unemployment had been such a big concern. People standing in food lines, people even dying to some extent, people not able to feed their families, families being broken up. My own story of this is my parents both grew up during the Great Depression. I was a little bit of a surprise later on in life, a second marriage. My father was 50, my mother 40 when they had me, which is how I can have parents and not great-grandparents that were born during the Great Depression. My mother was born in 1934. She grew up in a farm in Honey Grove, Texas, during the Great Depression, and they credited the fact that they were farmers, that they were able to survive because they could grow their own food. Most of the people in the city had it a lot worse. When the jobs fell out and people didn't have food, it was either the soup lines or they may have starved. A lot of them moved out in the country looking for work, but a lot of times there wasn't any money to pay them. So they would work basically for food and lodging, sometimes sleeping out in the fields if they had to, just to have the ability to eat and to have some sort of work. But even a lot of people back then, they were overwhelming the farms, and the farms didn't need that many people. My father was born in 1924, about 10 years older than my mother. And again, during that period of time, he joined the Navy, and he was part of D-Day. He was part of the landing on Normandy. He was the second stage of that. He was a medic and a radio operator. So during the event, the D-Day event, he was on the radio, helping to coordinate. They landed right after the first wave. They had to secure the beach. They had to deal with all the wounded. He was a radio operator. He was having to radio back and forth what was going on. There was mass confusion. A lot of people know this story. It didn't go exactly like the Allies thought, and so the radio operators and the medics were very important to the survival of that campaign and the survival of people that have been injured during that campaign. In any case, I remember the stories back then, and I remember how hard it was because my parents didn't let me forget. And even though my dad died when I was younger, he died when I was a baby, I still had all the letters from the time that he was in Europe progressing towards Germany. And I have the stories from my older siblings who told me, that campaign and what had happened. Of course, I had the stories from my mother as well. So I remember this period very, very well. Well, after the Great Depression, Congress passed the Employment Act of 1946. This is after the Great Depression and the conclusion of World War II. Congress, wanted to do some things for the American people. And among the things that act had was it declared responsibility of the federal government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. In other words, we need to focus on employment and growth. We're not worried about inflation, which made sense back then. You weren't going to have inflation when you had an economy that was just decimated and was a wartime economy, and it had to be transformed into something new. So back then, this act made sense. The problem is this act stayed for a very long time. Congress and the Fed adopted this for a very long time, and now I think it's starting to backfire just a bit. Michael goes on to write that this act is a seminal basis for the Federal Reserve's current dual mandate to maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates. In other words, easy monetary supply can be traced back to this Employment Act of 1946, not the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, when we started having all this quantitative easing. No, this roots of the policies that we have today were dated back to this 1946, which at the time it was passed made perfect sense, even though now it's a completely different economic situation. It was to promote maximum employment, stable prices, moderate long-term interest rates. Sounds good based on what we had seen back then, but it also led to this, and I think it led to the great inflation that we're having now. As Michael goes on to state, the orthodoxy guiding policy in the post-World War II area was Keynesian stabilization policy, motivated in large part by the painful memory of the unprecedented high unemployment of the United States and around the world during the 1930s. The focal point of these policies was the management of aggregate spending or demand by way of the spending and taxation policies of the fiscal authority, monetary policies of the central bank. This is the government and the bank working together for these purposes on behalf of the people. Dating back then, it made sense. At the time, it made sense. But just because something makes sense at the time doesn't mean it needs to be there forever. I think that's really the lesson to be learned from all of this. And Michael goes on to write that the idea that monetary policy can and should be used to manage aggregate spending and stabilize economic activity is still a generally accepted tenet, that guides the policies of the Federal Reserve and other central banks today. And he's talking about now in 2022. But one critical and erroneous assumption to the implementation of stabilization policy of the 1960s and 1970s was that there existed a stable, exploitable relationship between unemployment and inflation. Specifically, it was generally believed that permanently lower rates of unemployment could be bought with modestly higher rates of inflation. And as it turns out from some researchers afterwards, that ended up being a big mess. And it turns out that a couple of economists warned back then that this would not work. Edmund Phelps and Milton Friedman, both in the late 1960s, warned about it. Said Phelps, if the statistical optimum is chosen, it is reasonable to suppose that the participants in product and labor markets will learn to expect inflation, and that as a consequence of their rational anticipatory behavior, the Phillips curve will gradually shift upward. In other words, the trade-off between employment and inflation may have wanted to pursue likely to be a false bargain. Now we know why we had the great inflation back then and the one now. So the collapse of Bretton Woods occurred, and I'm going to summarize this. Bretton Woods was a backing of currencies with gold, but each nation state had different currency policy. They weren't linked worldwide. Therefore, that failed. Too much currency was printed. Gold was leaving the coffers of the Americans and drifting towards other nations in the West, especially Europe. But we also know that occurred in China and other places as well. And over the next several years after President Nixon halted the exchange of dollars for gold, there was an attempt to salvage the global monetary system through the Smithsonian Agreement, but the new arrangement fared no better than Bretton Woods, and it broke down. The post-war global monetary system was finished. The late 60s and 70s were a turbulent time for the U.S. economy. President Johnson's Great Society legislation brought about major spending programs across a broad array of social initiatives at a time when the U.S. fiscal situation was already being strained by the Vietnam War. These growing fiscal imbalances complicated monetary policy. So in other words, what's the Fed do? Now, it is being a little bit apologetic towards the Fed. The Fed had embraced this, of course, because they were earning interest on money printed. They had a great amount of power they never had before. It led to the rise of the technocratic class and the technocratic economists that would rule the economy in the present day, in which we've seen that they have had continued failed policies. But to be fair, those policies are in conjunction with policies and legislation that Congress and the government is printing in order to meet needs of the people. So at some point, we have to go back and look at the mirror as the American people and say, what is our role in this? We can blame the Fed, we can blame Congress, we can blame the politicians, we can blame the wars and all those other things. But at the end of the day, we were all alive during all of this. And even though a lot of people were protesting and speaking out against it, overall, people accepted it. And so we have a role in this as well. Treasury issues were infrequent, and the Fed's even-keel policies didn't interfere with implementation of monetary policy, but that's monetary policy. The fiscal policy, the debt issues became more prevalent. The Federal Reserve's adherence to even-keel principle constrained the conduct of monetary policy. This is back in 2005. So a change came, and the change was unrestrained monetary policy in light of the 2008 and 2009 crash. From high inflation to inflation targeting, the conquest of U.S. inflation became a goal. Phelps and Feldman were right. Michael goes on to write, the stable trade-off between inflation and employment proved unstable. The ability of policymakers to control any real variable was ephemeral. This truth included the rate of unemployment, which oscillated around its natural rate. The trade-off that policymakers hoped to exploit simply didn't work. It didn't exist. As businesses and households came to appreciate and indeed anticipate rising prices, any trade-off between inflation and unemployment became a less favorable exchange until in time, both inflation and unemployment became unacceptably high. This became the era of stagflation. And then, of course, we know what happened. Volcker came into the Fed and he raised interest rates up to 18 and almost 19%, which was a bid to bring down the economy, slow it down just a bit so we could get rid of inflation, and it worked. And that worked back then because we didn't have high amounts of debt to GDP like we have now. As you guys will know now from articles I've written, we're over 90% debt to GDP. And Reinhart Rogoff, in some research that they did for Harvard and that's been published since, went on to show that once you get past that 90% debt to GDP rate, none of this policy actually works. and you're going to have persistently high inflation, and you're going to have some sort of debt or fiscal reset, which is what I believe we're going to have going forward. This article goes into more about the 1970s and what happened. And it's an interesting article to explain really what happened during that time and how those policies, which seemed to make sense back then, morphed into the policies that we have now that are not working because they're legacy policies. And so now there is a lot of consternation about what is the government and the Fed going to do. And there's a raging debate. I remember Ron Paul sitting as a member of Congress asking Ben Bernanke whether he supported silver as an alternative circulating money and whether we needed alternative money. And the central bankers have said, no, we don't need money. I also find it interesting, however, that when Alan Greenspan, prior to joining the Fed, talked about gold being the stability in the fiscal system, then when he was with the Fed, led the expansion of this monetary policies and monetary aggregates. And then after he left, he's been talking about gold again. He's been on tons of interviews talking about the stability of gold. There's something along the lines of, once you become part of the Fed or part of the government, you abandon regular fiscal and monetary policies. You go in this expansion phase because you think that's what people want. But then when you come out of it and you're no longer in that system, you realize, oh, crap, well, maybe we should have stuck by gold. That's what happened to Alan Greenspan. I believe Alan Greenspan is telling us we probably should have stuck with gold at one point, that expansionary phase probably didn't benefit the American people as much as anticipated. And I think this piece from Michael, one of the Fed historians, basically, an historian with and a banker with the Fed, is basically telling us the same thing. It's telling us the root of why we're dealing with the issues now. Now, fast forward to 2022, we have high inflation, the labor force participation rate, the only completely comprehensive measure on the current state of employment in the U.S. is down around 62+%, which is lower than the overall employment rate we had dating back to the past two recessions of 2008, 2009, and 2001. And so I believe we haven't solved the issues of unemployment that we've had dating back then. And now that we see persistently high unemployment and we're seeing inflation, I think we see the culmination of these policies started in 1946. They're coming to fruition in the United States and are going to cause and be a large part of the reason for the next recession. But I do think that during the next recession, the good news is that people are going to come out and say, we want a different system. Now, I've talked about central bank digital currencies in previous blogs and videos, and that's the system that the central bankers and the governments envision for us now. Given their track record of success or lack thereof, depending on how you view it and the time period and the lens in which you're viewing it, I think we need to go back and examine the central bank digital currencies and decide if they're right for us. And if they are or they aren't, however, keep our options open, learning from history on the power of precious metals and gold and silver. So despite what system they come up with for us to use and that we're going to be participating in, I do believe that we need to keep precious metals in our portfolio to stabilize our portfolio during that time, to have money to pay for things that we need to counteract the effects of inflation, and God forbid we lose our jobs, be there to support us during that time of unemployment where we have money to help our families and ourselves. And so I still think, regardless of the system that they come up with, gold and silver should continue to play a big role in our fiscal plans and in our economic plans as individuals, that despite the best efforts of the smartest financial minds in setting up this system, that we remember the times that we've had and the periods of struggle in the past, and that we remember to protect ourselves and to protect ourselves within our community. And that really is my Thanksgiving Day message. Bless all of you during this Thanksgiving period. Thank you for dropping by and listening to our content on the Jan Bullion YouTube channel, as well as reading the blogs. It's been our absolute pleasure this year to be a part of Jan Bullion, to be a part of your community and your family. And we hope that you have a very, very blessed holiday. And of course, we'll be back right after the holiday with more content to help you on your precious metals journey. From my family to yours, have a very blessed and safe Thanksgiving holiday.